Today we're handling a question from a listener, but before we do that, let's talk about how the gospel has spread versus how the message of Islam has spread throughout church history. Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where we explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture. I'm Tyler. Andrew's here. Ben is out today. Ben and I both have sons that have birthdays today. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. Ramsey and Marty share a birthday. They're a year apart, but they share a birthday. All right. So, Andrew, let's just jump right in. We do this thing here at Northwest Gospel Church called Noon Prayer. If you're part of NGC, you're welcome to come. Every Thursday at noon, we come together, we sing a couple songs, we kind of just break out into the auditorium and have a few, probably 15 minutes or so of like personal prayer time. And then we come together and we pray through the text that has been chosen for that day. And today's text, if I remember, was from Acts 16, kind of even the beginnings of the church at Philippi, kind of where it all started. And one of the prayer focuses was I think it was just thanking God for the spread of the gospel, right? And as you were praying for that prayer focus, you brought up something really interesting that I was like, oh, we should talk about that on the podcast. And so this idea, and Max, if he was correct in talking about it this morning, talked about how the gospel was already kind of spreading in Asia and stuff like that, but then it was moving west, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of started in this spot in Philippi, and then the Great Commission just exploded from there, and kind of how the gospel spread. And in your prayer, you even talked, because of a recent conversion story we heard about somebody here at our church, about, you kind of just made a quick reference to the difference between the way the gospel has spread throughout the last couple thousand years and the way something like Islam spread. Yeah. And so I thought, let's just talk about that. So give us a seminary level church history lesson.
With no prep.
No, but let's talk about, Christianity first, the gospel.
Sure.
Like, somebody reads Acts 16, reads Acts 1 through 28. Where did it go from there?
Yeah.
And kind of just basics, and then let's juxtapose that with the way, like you mentioned Islam, with the way the Muslim faith has spread in that same time period.
Yeah. Well, and you see in Acts. So you see the gospel. Jesus says, "You'll be my witnesses, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And we see that played out even by chapter 8 in the book of Acts. You see that the expanse is going to be to the ends of the earth. I think that the Acts 8 text with the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip evangelizing him, and then him taking it back to Ethiopia. Ethiopia was considered the ends of the earth to those who were, the Hebrew mindset around Jerusalem and Judea. They would picture, and it's actually called that in a few places in the Old Testament, like Ethiopia, which in the Old Testament is called Cush, and it's not modern day Ethiopia. It's kind of Sudan in that area, but that region was considered the ends of the earth to the Jews, and so that's a clear story showing that what Jesus said when you receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, you're going to be my witnesses. That we already see that playing out just even a third of the way through the book of Acts. So as Acts continues to go, you see it spread through Asia Minor. You see Paul's various missionary travels. The first 10 chapters or so focus on the apostles, Peter, and the spread sort of to the ends of the earth, and to the of course Jerusalem's like the first 7-8 chapters, and then you get the persecution at the beginning of chapter 8 after the Stephen martyrdom, and that diaspora or spreading out of the persecution of the Christians, then they bring the gospel with them wherever they go, and you start to see that played out. Acts 10, it starts to clearly go to the Gentiles through the Cornelius story, and then of course in Acts 9, that sort of overlaps Acts 10 and 11, you start to see the pivot to the ministry of Paul, right? And so all the way through Acts, then you see the missionary journeys of Paul, the Philippian story like you talked about, and those various things, and he's going back, and the center of the church kind of goes from Jerusalem up to Antioch, which is a more Jew-Gentile type of place. And then at the end of Acts, you have Paul in Rome, who, and even preaching Philippians now, Paul, under house arrest in Rome, is writing letters like that and corresponding with those churches. So, and I'm even going to address it a little bit Sunday as we preach the second passage from Philippians. Like it was a couple hundred years that and you can read Fox's Book of Martyrs and just other books that kind of talk about the history post the scriptures, but for the next several generations, you have from the ministry of the original apostles to the early church fathers. We have so much literature from that period of time, and that shows how the gospel spread through the people of God being continually persecuted, and all over the known world it begins to spread to where finally, a few centuries later, in the early 4th century, you have the Roman Empire, like it's become Christianized, right? And you have Constantine, and in essence, there's a lot of debate over, was Constantine actually a Christian, or was this just like a political move? But at the very least, you have to say that the Constantine era in the early 4th century there, 325 or so AD, that the Roman Empire, it was like, when you can't beat them, join them, like the Christianity spread through the whole Roman Empire to that point where it became sort of the dominant religion in the Western world, and all the way to this day. I think that would be a continuance of that. So go forward 300 years in the early 7th century. The start of Islam is kind of seen to be around the year 610 AD, about 600 years after Christ, and Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, getting a vision, and then it's spreading from there. So, just very broad brushstrokes. So, what led me into that in the prayer was my prayer focus that Max had put together, and I was one of the ones who was praying there, was on like the spread of the Great Commission and us keeping our focus on that, right? And then Courtney had shared right before we prayed about somebody who was a Muslim that used to be a Muslim who got saved and then got baptized this last week at NGC. And so as I was praying, and that's where I kind of mentioned in the prayer was the thinking about the spread of the Great Commission through the people of God being persecuted, and those first few centuries, all the things that were done to Christians, and yet, in spite of that, they're martyred and persecuted and driven from place to place, and everywhere they go, they bring the gospel with them, and it like transforms and turns the world upside down. Whereas the spread of Islam did not take place that way. The spread of Islam from the early 7th century was conquest-based, military-based, that Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula throughout North Africa, and then all the way the Middle East, North Africa, and then even up into Europe through force, through hundreds of years of like brutal warfare that under the banner of Islam and Muhammad that the Muslims did there. So that even to this day, those areas are still heavily Islamic, and yet it spread in a different way. It wasn't that they went from place to place just kind of evangelizing and then they were persecuted. They went out in violent force and took over those regions, many of which were Christianized. And to that point, and I mean, you think of like St. Augustine came out of North Africa, right? And he was in North Africa, a couple hundred years before Islam started, and that was a pretty Christianized area, but it got taken over by Islam, and still is heavily Islamic to this day. So, a lot of people, talk about the Crusades, and sort of in a historically illiterate way, act as if the Crusades were just like Christianity went for, 1,000 years, and then they just decided to go kill everybody. You're like, that's not what happened. Historically, the Crusades were a response to the Islamic revolutions that took over those countries. And was it a right response? Like, were the Crusades like, yeah, that's what Jesus said to do? No, but they were a military response to the spread of Islam by military force. And so this isn't excusing the Crusades or saying, well, they did it, so we should do it. That's not, again, I'm not excusing that at all, but historically speaking, it's illiterate to be like, well, the Crusades were like unprovoked and Christians just decided to go kill everybody. And they were a direct military response to the spread of Islam to that point, 300 to 400 years by violent force. And so, and that was certainly a dark time in church history, but that was what provoked that. There's a book by Rodney Stark called God's Battalions that gives a little bit of history of that, but you can find a ton out there on that. But so yeah, and I was just thinking through in my prayer the juxtaposition of that, the violence that you see in the spread of Islam versus like all throughout the Islamic world since Islam started, you've seen the spread of the gospel, maybe in some ways, and most of it not even really public, right? Because of the implications of converting to Christianity and receiving the death penalty in a lot of those cultures. You see that the Lord continues to save his people, even in spite of these ideologies and idolatries and things. So yeah, anyway, that was just a little bit super Cliff Notes version. But yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, the juxtaposition, until you were praying that today.
Yeah.
And I was
and it's a different, we have different values than the religions of this world, than man-made religions, than idolatrous ideologies. We have a different value set and a different, and the gospel spreads in a different way. It doesn't spread by military force. It spreads through the preaching of the gospel and the declaring of the gospel. And so it's beautiful to think about and inspiring to think about what the Lord is doing to save his people all over the world, and to even how the Lord brings people from all over the world to different locales and brings them to salvation through the preaching of his word. It's pretty awesome, dude. And could make you pretty hopeful if you meditate on that,
Yeah, that's really cool. Cody, how much time we got on the clock? 12 minutes. Cool. Let's talk about some other stuff then. All right, I'll give you an option here. Choose your own adventure, Andrew. Would you rather have like a spiritual disciplines question or an ecclesiology question?
Ecclesiology.
All right, here we go. All right, this comes from a listener. They said, hey, my family and I have been going to NGC for a few months and really love everything about the church. One question we have is, why is there not a cross in the auditorium? I've always looked to the cross while singing as it symbolized the sacrifice Jesus made for us. Looking at the people on stage with the lights on the ceiling isn't the same as the cross. We love NGC and love the podcast. God bless.
Yeah. What do we say? BYOC? Ty?
Bring your own cross. I've never said that. When I first saw this question, I was like kind of taken full circle because like one of the first episodes of this podcast, which I mean, geez, now is what?
8 years?
8 years ago. Early on in the days of this podcast, if you're newer with us, we had a segment called Anonymous Comments where we would take the best comments that people would leave us anonymously, like in the little seat backs or in the offering envelope or whatever, and we would read them on the podcast and discuss them, and it made for some really fun stuff. But one of the first ones we ever did was about why, because we had what we did have at one point were light up crosses. And so on each of the two side panels of the auditorium, there was a like an intelligent light that shone on each of those, and it was actually in the shape of a cross.
Yeah. So they were like just a projection, basically.
A projection. Yeah. Yeah. And so and one day one of those went away, and then like a year later, the other one went away. And then when the podcast started, we'd gotten this, I think if I remember right, it was a lot less, like this question's great. This question's gracious.
Yeah.
And it's like they want to know.
Yeah.
That anonymous comment was like, I think didn't they say like, just what, does Rick Warren run this church or something like that?
Yeah.
Which was I didn't even understand what they meant by that comment. But it was really funny.
Sure.
And in reality, what happened at that season was those light bulbs burned out, and money was a lot tighter than
we were broke.
and we did not want to spend the few $100s to replace them. But so that was the reality 8 years ago, and like why we didn't have the light up crosses anymore in the auditorium is because we wanted to be able to keep the electricity on.
Sure.
And it wasn't that stark, but you know.
Yeah.
But what would you say to somebody who says like, hey, why not?
Yeah, well, there's no specific reason why not. There's no I don't have anything against having a cross in the auditorium, and but then I'm also not I also don't feel like if there's not a cross in the auditorium, we're somehow compromising the gospel or whatever. Like better to preach the cross than like just to have one in the auditorium and not preach it. And I don't think those are the options here. I don't think you have to do either or. You could have a cross in the auditorium and preach it. Camas has a ginormous cross, don't they, in the auditorium?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
It hangs above the baptistry, like straight on. So yeah, our Camas church has a big cross there in the auditorium. We have one on top of our building here. Does Camas have one on top of their building? I don't think they do.
I don't know.
So we're more outward with our faith here at East Vancouver than Camas is. We're not afraid to like actually show the cross, Ben, to the wider world, whereas you guys are ashamed, I guess, over there. I don't know, but they probably have a cross on the outside, and I'll notice it when I'm driving home today. But no, so yeah, there's no reason that there's not a cross in there. I don't have anything against it. So that would be the answer to that. So. Yeah, I don't know. What would you say, Ty, on that side?
I mean, there's no like theological reason that we don't have one.
Sure.
I think that, a lot of the decision making that goes into the way the auditorium looks from a presentation standpoint is we work a lot for the sermon series whenever we have banners to kind of be the focal point of the auditorium so that we can, even as we're singing a song, I want people to be thinking, like, how does like what we're learning in Philippians inform this truth of the gospel we're singing? So like, so when we do the sermon series banners, like we don't have one right now, but when we do the sermon series banners, like that's kind of one of the things that goes into the decision making, what should be on the platform. Also, just from we want the cleanest look possible for the camera situation with our live stream and stuff like that. But that's not a reason, like none of those are reasons why we don't have a cross. It's just like, those are the kind of things that the decision-making processes that go into it.
Sure.
And there have been a couple times where the cross has been on the platform in the form of the graphic from the banner.
Exactly.
Right. And then that'll be like texts, like towards the end of each of the gospels and stuff like that. Whenever we've had sermon series like that. And
sure.
If you go to NGC, which this question asker does, you can go down that hallway on the east side of the building and see every sermon series we preached in the last 10 years and see the different artistic manifestations of what those different passages have been.
Yeah. Cool.
So
good question.
Yeah. And I would say that like this gets me thinking like, oh, like I'm not somebody who looks to the cross while singing for this as the symbol, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting. Like I love hearing from people. It's like, oh, this helps me focus and as I'm worshiping through music. I'm always interested to hear like what types of things those are for people.
That's a good question.
Yeah. All right. Are we at 20 minutes yet, Cody?
18.
Yeah, close enough. If you have questions for us, we'd love to hear from you. Podcast@tobeTheChurch.com is the best place to send those in. We'll probably have Ben back with us next week, and we will see you then.